When you leave the city behind, Britain changes, trading concrete edges for hedgerows, stone walls, and patient open fields. Out here, work moves at the pace of weather and seasons, not timetables, and the old trades still hold their breath. Follow the quiet lane long enough, and you arrive in a world that believes tools can outlive the hands that hold them. This is where forgotten rural crafts once shaped everyday life, before silence and engines replace skills passed down by memory. At dawn, a shepherd steps onto the hillside, his boots sinking into wet grass silvered by the first thin light. The flock waits like a slow-moving cloud, scattered across the slope, while his whistle cuts the morning air with practiced ease. For generations, this landscape was read like a book, every ridge and hollow a familiar sentence in a family language. Today, only a few remember how to guide hundreds of animals with nothing more than calls, patience, and a wooden staff. The dogs move first, black and white streaks flowing around the edges of the flock like ink finding its outline. A glance, a gesture, a single word is enough to send them racing, shaping wool and movement into ordered lines. These animals are colleagues as much as companions, understanding signals that were never written down, only lived and repeated. Once shepherding was not an image on a postcard, but a hard-skilled trade that held entire hillsides together. Listen closely and the hillside speaks in small sounds. Hooves on damp soil, low bleats, the soft jangle of bells. In the 1950s, many families knew this soundtrack from birth, growing old to the same steady rural rhythm. Now, the same slopes are quieter, the old shepherds retired or gone, their methods replaced by vehicles and wire fences. The craft survives in fragments, in stories told beside fires, and in faded photographs tucked into drawers. Beyond the sheep fields, another craft once kept the countryside turning, hidden behind barn doors streaked with oil and dust. Here worked the wheelwright, the quiet engineer of the rural road, shaping timber and iron into sturdy, turning circles. Every cart, every wagon, every farm vehicle rested its weight on his judgment of curve, grain, and strength. A crack in the wrong place could spell disaster, so his work combined mathematics of the hand with instinct of the eye. Inside the workshop, the air is thick with the smell of cut oak, damp steam, and burnt metal on cold mornings. Spokes lie in careful rows, each one numbered, each measured to fit a wheel that exists only in his mind. He soaks rims in water, bends them slowly, and listens for the faint complaints of timber under pressure. Then comes the iron, heated until it glows, hammered into place before cooling water seals wood and metal together. For centuries, this process barely changed, passed from master to apprentice through repetition rather than diagram. By the late 1960s, tractors, factory-made wheels had done what time alone never could, make his skills unnecessary. Old tools hung untouched, edges dull in, while the last orders trickled in from those unwilling to abandon tradition. In some villages, the final wheel left the workshop like a farewell, rolling out into a world that no longer needed. Not far away, another wooden world thrived in low, drafty sheds, where rural carpenters turned raw planks into permanence. They built doors that would outlast the families walking through them, tables that heard 3 generations of stories and arguments. Their measurements lived in their fingers and eyes, not in printed manuals, each cut the product of long familiarity. In the 1950s, you knew a village by its carpentry, by the fit of its doors, the grain of its stair rail. These workers moved slowly but surely, shaving away thin curls of wood that fell like quiet snow at their feet. They trusted hand planes more than machines, listening to the sound of blade against grain for signs of trouble. Every joint was a small act of faith, a promise that wood, if respected, would hold firm through winters and repairs. Their work rarely carried signatures, but their style was unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look close. Further along the lane stands a cottage wearing its roof like a thatched cap, thick, uneven and carefully layered. In the mid-century countryside, thatchers were still called when straw needed renewing. Climbing steep roofs with calm assurance, they read a roof the way others read weather, seeing where water would gather, where wind would tug and tease. With bundles of reed and straw, they stitched protection into place, aligning each handful with near ritual precision. On the ridge, their silhouette looks almost timeless, a figure bent at the waist, hands moving in small, efficient motions. Below, curious children might gather to watch, craning necks as old techniques turned raw plant material into shelter. The tools are simple hooks, knives, mallets, Yet the knowledge behind them stretches back centuries across rural Britain. By the 1970s, many of these roofs had been replaced, and with them went steady work for those who mastered thatch. Beside the river, another trade once harnessed motion, turning flowing water into flour, timber cuts, and grinding power. Watermills dotted the countryside, their wheels creaking patiently as they converted natural force into everyday necessities. Inside the mill, white dust hung in the air like quiet weather, settling on hair, clothes, and wooden beams. Workers knew the language of the machinery intimately, the change in pitch that warned of strain, the rattle that predicted failure. In the 1950s, these mills were already living on borrowed time, their ancient mechanisms competing with modern engines. Yet for a while longer, sacks of grain still arrived by cart, hoisted on shoulders, emptied into chutes with practiced ease. The miller's hands carried permanent flour stains, his clothes never entirely free of the pale evidence of his trade. Customers trusted his judgment of weight and quality more than distant labels, relying on personal reputation rather than branding. As industry centralized, small mills fell silent, their wheels stilled, not by catastrophe, but by quiet economic logic. Streams once diverted to drive them returned to natural courses, or were left trickling through weeded channels. Buildings became storage, homes, or ruins. The sound of grinding stones replaced by birds and the steady rush of water. What survived was not the machinery, but the memory of a time when rivers powered the rhythm of rural work. Across the countryside, another craft wove its way through daily life, shaping containers from living wood. Basket makers took willow from riverbanks and plantations, cutting rods in winter when sap ran low and fibers were pliable. They sorted by thickness and length, their hands moving automatically through a sequence learned from elders and repetition. In farmyards, markets, and kitchens, their baskets carried eggs, tools, vegetables, and hopes, strong yet surprisingly light. Each region had its own patterns, subtle variations in weave that told a local story without needing work. Some baskets were made for back carrying, others for horses, others still for boats and river work. By the 1950s, plastic and metal were beginning their slow advance, promising durability without the need for maintenance. The basket maker watched orders shrink, not suddenly, but year by year, as cheaper imports edged out his carefully woven work. Still, for a time, his workshop remained busy, especially before harvest, when every spare container had a job to do. The sound of soaked willow creaking under pressure, the tap of knife and thumb formed its own quiet soundtrack. These baskets were repairable, mendable, designed to live long lives with their owners, changing color and texture with age. When the last generation of makers retired, many of their patterns left with them, unrecorded, but once deeply familiar. The rural postman walked a different path through this world, connecting scattered homes with slow, steady footsteps. His route crossed fields, lanes, and farm tracks, bringing letters, news, and small parcels to places maps barely acknowledged. In the 1950s, he was more than a courier. He was a regular visitor, a known face, a piece of moving routine. He learned the dogs, the gates, the shortcuts across meadows, and the unspoken worries written in the way envelopes were held. This was a trade built on trust and stamina, with long days in all weathers, carrying stories in a worn leather bag. He saw the countryside change, house by house, watching new machinery arrive, old sheds collapse, and children leave for cities. By the time vans and sorting centres took over, many of these walking groups had already shrunk or disappeared. Yet in memory the image remains clear, a solitary figure on a narrow lane, carrying connection door to door. Another quiet expert tended creatures far smaller than sheep or cattle, but vital to rural life and harvest. The village beekeeper worked with hives that often looked handmade, wooden boxes or woven skeps tucked into sunny corners. His movements were calm, deliberate, shaped by respect for insects that could sting, but mostly preferred to be left undisturbed. He read their mood in sound and smell, sensing when to approach, when to close, when to harvest honey gently. In the mid-20th century, beekeeping remained a blend of tradition and observation, balancing yield with the health of the colony. Honey was more than sweetness, it was medicine, winter comfort, and a small source of extra income for rural households. Wax too found its place in candles, polishes, and small repairs, nothing wasted from the hive's careful industry. Modern pressures, chemicals, and changes in land use gradually altered this relationship, making old, simple methods harder to maintain. Beside narrow waterways, another group worked in close partnership with gates, ropes, and slow-moving boats. Canal workers kept rural Britain supplied long before motorways, guiding barges loaded with coal, grain, and building material. Lock keepers knew every rise and fall of water, every stubborn gate that needed extra force, every tricky bend. They coordinated by eye and shout, timing releases so that goods could move steadily from inland farms to distant towns. In the 1950s, canals had already passed their busiest era, but many still carried working traffic alongside emerging leisure use. The men who tended them measured days not by clocks, but by which boat arrived first at the morning lock. They patched banks, cleared debris, mended paddles, and watched for leaks that might undermine the whole system quietly. When road haulage finally eclipsed them, a whole network of skills receded into the background, preserved only in fragments. On small farms, dairying remained a demanding twice-daily ritual that shaped every other task around it. Cows needed milking at the same times, every day, whatever the weather, whatever else the world was doing. In low milking parlours and open yards, farmers bent to their work, hands moving with practiced, efficient repetition. Milk travelled not in cartons, but in churns, lifted by hand, loaded onto carts or small lorries for collection. These small dairies often operated on wafer-thin margins, relying on family labour and the predictability of local demand. They knew each cow individually by temperament, yield and habit, adjusting feed and care with intimate daily attention. As larger units grew and centralisation increased, many of these smaller dairy farms found they could not compete. Their departure changed more than the economy it altered the soundscape and smell of rural mornings across Britain. Not all disappearing trades were tied to animals and fields. Some belonged to the way people kept warm. In woodland clearings, charcoal burners once worked slow, smoky miracles with carefully stacked piles of timber. They understood how to restrict air, judge temperature, and wait as wood transformed into dense black fuel. Charcoal was vital for blacksmiths, bakers, and households before other fuels took over, binding woodland management to industry. By the 1950s, this craft was already rare, surviving in pockets where tradition and necessity overlapped. Burners lived semi-isolated lives during their work, tending smoking mounds through days and nights in all weather. Their knowledge of fire was intimate and controlled, quite different from the open blaze of hearth or furnace. As coal, gas, and electricity spread, the demand for their carefully made product dwindled almost to nothing. Across wetlands and river margins, reed cutters once harvested long straight stems destined for roofs and mats. They worked knee-deep in water, moving methodically, cutting close to the base, bundling as they went. Timing mattered, choosing the right season when reeds were strong but not yet brittle, ready for long service. In some regions, whole communities depended on this seasonal work, filling winters with preparation for future building. Mechanization, drainage, and changing building fashions gradually reduced the need for large quantities of hand-cut reed. Marshes that once rang with the slice of blades and voices now often lie quiet, repurposed or abandoned. The craft persists in specialist corners, but the everyday, unremarkable familiarity it once enjoyed is mostly gone. Yet along the banks, you can still imagine the lines of bundled reed drying in the cold wind. On the edges of fields, men who understood hedges shaped the living boundaries that held the countryside together. Hedge layers cut and bent stems, just enough to guide growth sideways, creating dense, stock-proof barriers from living wood. Their work balanced force and care, knowing exactly how far each stem could be persuaded without breaking. In the 1950s, this skill still defined field lines in many counties, a form of green engineering older than maps. Modern fencing, cheaper and faster to install, gradually replaced much of this careful, time-consuming craft. Where once a hedge represented years of guidance and maintenance, wire and post could appear in a single afternoon. As the technique faded, so too did some of the wildlife corridors and windbreaks those living fences quietly provide. What remains stands as a reminder that boundaries can be grown as well as built. Even in the quiet of village evenings, crafts continued behind workshop windows lit by single steady bulbs. Leather workers repaired harnesses, bridles and belts, keeping horses and farm equipment functional, long before decorative fashion took precedence. Their benches held awls, needles and punches, tools designed not to impress but to endure within calloused hands. Every stitch, every rivet, extended the life of an object someone depended on daily, often without thinking about it. As horsepower became mechanical, the demand for these repairs shrank or shifted to different kinds of work. The old patterns hanging on nails cut from a stiff card began to curl and fade untouched. Some leather workers adapted, turning from harness to luggage or shoes, chasing markets in a changing world. Others closed their doors quietly, leaving behind the distinct smell of treated hide and oil that once defined their spaces. These disappearing trades shared more than geography. They shared an understanding that time, skill, and patience were their real materials. In 1950s rural Britain, they still formed a web of expertise, each craft supporting and relying on the other. Today what remains are fragments of tool in a museum, an elderly practitioner, a half-remembered term in local speech. But if you walk those lanes and fields with attentive eyes, you can still sense the echo of work that shaped them. Out here, memory lives not only in photographs and archives, but in the gestures people once repeated without thinking. Hands learned by doing, by watching, by failing and trying again, far from classrooms and formal instruction. Each trade carried its own quiet discipline, a way of moving through the day that shaped bodies and minds alike. In the 1950s, these patterns still held firm, even as distant engines and factory lights signaled coming change. The people who practiced these crafts rarely called themselves custodians of heritage. They simply did what their parents and neighbours had done before, trusting continuity more than novelty. What we now call lost arts were, for them, daily routines carried out between meals, weather reports, and family news. Only later did their disappearance reveal how much structure they had given to rural life. Walk through those landscapes today, and it is easy to miss what is no longer there. Fields still stretch to the horizon. Hedges still mark boundaries, roofs still shelter families from the rain. But look closer, and the absences begin to show the missing footsteps, the silent yards, the idle chimney. The countryside did not empty. It changed workers once tied to hand skills, now replaced by machines and distant systems. For a while, progress felt simple. Faster deliveries, cheaper goods, less labour for the same visible result. Yet something subtle slipped away with each vanished workshop and silent mill. Something hard to count but easy to feel. Communities lost not only jobs, but shared points of reference. Places where knowledge gathered and moved between generations. A village without its craftsmen is not just quieter, it forgets part of its own vocabulary. These stories are not an argument against change, nor a demand to turn back every clock. They are an invitation to notice the cost of speed and to remember the value of slow expertise. The forgotten trades of rural Britain remind us that skill can be a kind of memory made visible. Every tool mark, every repaired hinge, every woven edge is a sentence in a language we are close to losing. Yet all is not only lost because traces remain in people, not just in places. A retired shepherd who still whistles to his dog without thinking. A former miller who weighs flour in his palm and knows, without scales, when it is enough. A basket maker who cannot pass a willow stand without checking its straightness and strength. These individuals carry archives in their muscle memory, living libraries of movements and decisions. Their stories reveal how much of our world was built by those whose names never reached official record. To listen to them is to step briefly back into a time before buttons and screens replaced direct understanding. It is to glimpse a Britain that trusted the slowness of hands as much as the speed of machines. As we look ahead, the question is not whether we can restore every lost trade exactly as it was. We cannot. And perhaps we should not, because the world they served has changed beyond recognition. But we can ask what their spirit might teach us about resilience, attention, and care. We can decide that efficiency alone is not enough if it erases the human stories behind ordinary things. Some crafts are quietly returning in new forms, taught in evening classes, small workshops, and community projects. Younger generations are learning to weave, carve, stitch, and mend, not out of necessity, but out of choice. They may never rely on these skills for survival, yet they discover a different kind of wealth in practicing them. A wealth measured in understanding, patience, and connection to materials that do not refresh with a click. In this way, the story of Britain's rural trades is not entirely closed. It bends, pauses, and resumes in unexpected places, carried by people who feel the pull of older rhythm. The tools may be newer, the settings more modern, but the impulse is recognizable across decades. An impulse to make, to repair, to belong to a place through the work of one's own hand. This film has walked only a few of the many paths that once crisscrossed the countryside. There are other stories waiting in quiet corners, of lime burners, dry stone wallers, shepherd's hut builders, and more. Each holds its own piece of the larger picture, another thread in the tapestry of rural Britain. Together they form a map of how people once turned landscape into livelihood season after season. So when the credits fade and the screen darkens, the invitation does not end. Perhaps you will look differently at an old barn, a crooked gate, a weathered roof on a lane you thought you knew. Perhaps you will hear, under the modern noise, the faint echo of tools, footsteps and voices that once filled these spaces. And perhaps you will wonder what other trades are vanishing quietly around us right now. In the next journey, we will travel further into this hidden archive of work and memory. We will meet the last guardians of crafts on the edge of disappearance, and the newcomers trying to learn from them. We will follow the threads from past to present, across workshops, fields and forgotten byways. Because Britain's story is not only written in its cities and wars, but in the patient labour of its countryside. Until then, the fields keep their secrets, and the empty workshops wait in the half-light, not for nostalgia, but for curiosity, for someone willing to ask what these places once meant. The next time you pass a quiet rural road, remember that behind those hedges, whole worlds of skill once lived, and somewhere another door is opening, ready to show how much of that quiet brilliance still survives.